This video is sponsored by Warhammer Chaos and Conquest. The days of the Grand Crusade were absolutely brutal. This was the time when the Emperor's armies set out across the stars to reunite the entirety of mankind's kingdom under the Emperor's banner. At times, this was done peacefully, and others through devastating open warfare. When reading the 40k novels, especially things set in the early part of the Horus Heresy, you'll often read about how worlds were made to be compliant. But what exactly does that mean, and how was it done? Well, today we're going to talk about a short story that really illustrates what the Space Marines did during the Grand Crusade in order to make these worlds compliant. And in addition, we're going to go over a summary of the Grand Crusade, what it was all about, and the absolutely brutal but necessary choices that Space Marines had to make during it. But before we dive into the Grimdark, a quick shout out to this week's sponsor. Warhammer Chaos and Conquest is the ultimate mobile MMO strategy and domination game. Set in the deep and immersive setting of the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and available for free on iOS, Android, and Windows. As the forces of chaos, your goal is to spread ruination and corruption across the old world. To do this, you will need to gather together an unstoppable horde of demons and chaos worshippers, construct the ultimate fortress, and claim your rightful place as the mighty ever-chosen of the Chaos Gods. As you progress in the game, you will build and train a powerful army by collecting powerful warlords and more than 30 unique demons and warriors of chaos units, each of which will dramatically increase the power of your armies. Each of these warlords can be customized with special equipment and skills to better suit your playstyle. And to achieve your goals, you're gonna need to join forces with other players. Alliances will grant you protection for your citadel, speed up your constructions, and net you a whole lot of additional benefits. You'll also have to garner favor with the Chaos Gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, by completing demonic rituals that boost your army's offensive and defensive capabilities. The game is chock full of side quests, special events, and daily challenges that will provide you with a bounty of warpstone and other valuable resources. You can use these to upgrade your base even faster, or unlock additional means to conquer your enemies. And by participating in realm battles, you can climb the leaderboard and claim your rightful place as the Ever-Chosen. Download the game by clicking the link in the description, or by scanning the QR code on the screen, and discover Warhammer Chaos and Conquest today. Thanks again to the awesome people over at Chaos and Conquest for sponsoring this video, and let's get into the Grimdark. The goal of the Grand Crusade was to reunite the thousands of human worlds that had been cut off from one another by massive warp storms generated during the Age of Strife, that would subsequently be cleared away with the birth of Slaanesh. Put simply, when a human world was encountered by the Imperial forces, it would either willingly join the Imperium, be liberated, or subjugated. I actually did a video on the entire timeline of Warhammer 40k, so if you want a more detailed explanation of these events, go ahead and check that out after you finish watching this. But to quickly summarize it, 10,000 years before the Great Crusade, there was a galactic human empire. That was until those massive anomalies known as warp storms made travel and communication between the worlds next to impossible. Suddenly, all of these planets were plunged into darkness and were left to fend for themselves in an unforgiving and brutal galaxy, filled with sentient nightmares that preyed upon mankind like livestock. The story for every planet was different. Some, by the time the Space Marines discovered them, had been reduced to a neo-feudalistic state, such as the worlds of Barbarous or Caliban, while others were incredibly technologically advanced, like the Kingdom of the Interrex. Every planet and culture was completely unique, and had been forced to be self-sufficient longer than anyone could remember. Some of these worlds had kept diligent records from their earliest histories, and remembered their origins on Earth, while many others had completely forgotten their origins. All records of Terra and their species' original existence, either having been completely wiped out, or seen simply as an ancient legend. Now, some planets were dominated by religion that worshipped their original home, while others saw their history as little more than a creation myth, where they had escaped a horrible barren rock that had been stripped of everything that once made it beautiful. Needless to say, the armies of the Imperium showing up on these planets were met with a wide array of different responses. Some welcomed them with open arms and happily joined the Imperium without conflict, while others rejected the Imperium. They had survived this long on their own and wanted to remain free. However, the Emperor's grand ambitions required complete and utter compliance. From the Imperium's perspective, rejecting their offer and remaining independent was not an option. In the vast majority of cases, a planet would be offered every chance to join peacefully. Space Marine delegates would venture down to the planet's surface, immerse themselves in the culture, and meet with all of their leaders. They would tell them the truth of their origins, where they had come from, and how they wished to see their world, Terra, and all of the planets under humanity's control united once again. And the proposal wasn't completely one-sided, as the Imperium would offer them protection from a galaxy filled with horrors, and that they would provide them weapons, technology, food, medicine, and anything they would need to make their lives considerably better and safer. Now that being said, they would have to pay a tithe of their natural resources and soldiers to the Imperial war effort. For some worlds it was lower and some it was higher, but every planet would need to contribute. And despite what the memes will tell you, under normal circumstances, every attempt at diplomacy was utilized for a successful integration into the Imperium. It was very rare that a legion would announce their presence by bombing a planet's capital from orbit. Not that that didn't happen, because there are definitely some documented instances of this occurring for various reasons. If the planet heard all of this and still rejected the Imperium's offer, then the Imperium would declare war on them. Now some worlds were developed enough to put up a pretty good fight, and the war for the planet would last a considerable amount of time. Now other worlds were in a more primitive state, and had no hope of defending themselves against the wrath of the Emperor's armies. In either circumstance, the Imperium would pour resources into the world to rebuild them back up, better and more technologically advanced than they were before. Now each of the legions of Space Marines had different philosophies on how they would handle this. For one, the Wordbearers would venture to a planet and stay there with its people for years, spreading worship of the Emperor, which the Emperor definitely didn't want and didn't really know about it at the time. But we'll get into that in another video. The major takeaway here is that they wanted the people to love them, to love the Emperor and his Imperium. A planet of worshippers would make for a much stronger ally than one who had been forced to their knees and dominated. The worlds they left would be covered in massive statues of these Marines, honoring them as the Emperor's beloved angels, the saviors that had come to their world and blessed them with wisdom and salvation. The Marines of the Wordbearers were loved by the people they left behind, at least in the early days of the Crusade. However, because they spent so much extra time on these planets, the Wordbearers were seen as incredibly inefficient, taking sometimes 10 or 100 times longer than their brothers to bring a world into compliance. Whereas another legion known as the Night Lords, they were a legion of fear, and had kind of the exact opposite idea. You see, they thought to take a world as quickly as possible, and with little to no actual warfare. They would basically go down to a planet and do a whole bunch of grotesque murders, skinning and torturing the world's leadership, and then broadcasting the acts to the entire sector. They'd string up the bodies in the town square as a grisly reminder of their superiority, a warning that if you don't want this to happen to you, you'll submit quickly and quietly. Their tactics were rightfully condemned by their brothers as evil and sadistic. There was at least honor in open warfare, but this was just butchery. The Night Lords were pretty brutal and horrific, but in their defense, they did have the lowest level of actual civilian casualties during their stint in the Crusade. But out of all the stories revolving around compliance, there's one that's always really stood out to me. I speak, of course, of Wolf at the Door, released as part of the Tales of Heresy anthology. It's about the Space Wolves and how they went about bringing the world of Antimon into compliance. I feel it gives a really amazing depiction of what this was actually like. It shows just how brutal this time period was, and demonstrates just how difficult the choices the Space Marines had to make truly were. A lot of the time when we talk about compliance in 40k, it's often focused on the macro setting. And in that sense, it often gets boiled down to either just a yes or a no. Did the planet accept compliance or did it refuse? One leads to integration and the other to open war, but it's a lot more messy than that. And in 40k, this is often just a footnote. But in other franchises, you could write hundreds of novels set on this one planet during this one war. And that's why I enjoyed this short story in particular. It gives a really excellent perspective on this often overlooked part of the Grand Crusade. And coming from someone who's often pretty critical of the Space Wolves of this era, this is actually, admittedly, one of my favorite stories about them. The tale begins with a group of Space Wolves from the 13th Great Company, on the surface of another world in the same sector as the previously mentioned planet. They had first visited this place 7 years prior. The Wolf Lord Bulveye had journeyed here and offered for them to join the Imperium. The planet was ruled by brutal slave masters that did unspeakable things to their population, and as part of the agreement, their ways would have to change. Bulveye held out his left hand to them in an offer of peace, and the slave masters laughed in his face. They rejected his offer and cast him out. And now, after years of battle, the planet has been decimated, and the slave master rulers of the world have been dragged before the Wolf Lord and his kin, stripped naked and forced to kneel in the snow before a crowd of their slaves that's looking on. A large hoard of jewels and valuable metals is also dragged forth and presented to the wolves, a tithe demanded by the Emperor. The lead space wolf, Bulveye Greybeard of the 13th Great Company, speaks to the slave masters of this world and says,
"And so we meet again, just as I told you we would 7 years ago. Back then I stood in your palace of crystal and steel and brought you glad tidings from our Allfather, the Emperor of mankind. I bore a message of welcome and promises of peace and order. I gave you this,"
he says, holding out his open left hand.
"You spat upon my palm. You scorned the gifts of my lord and sent me into the streets like a beggar, threatening to kill me if we ever met again. Before I left, I swore to you this day would come. Now your fleets have been broken, your armies scattered. Your palace of steel and crystal is no more. Your sons are dead, and your cities lie in ruins. You are tyrants no longer. You have been cast down, and I've seen to it that neither you nor your kind will ever rise again. Had it been left up to me, you would have never emerged from those tunnels. I would have turned this entire mountain into your tomb. But the All-Father in his wisdom has decided otherwise."
Gesturing at the treasure, he says,
"This wealth belongs to the many worlds you have despoiled, planets that became battlefields thanks to your arrogance and greed. You will use this fortune to begin rebuilding that which has been lost, and ensure the worlds of this subsector become prosperous and stable members of the Imperium. Each planet will have an Imperial governor to oversee their reconstruction, and they will send me regular reports of your efforts. Do not give me a reason to return here ever again."
His gaze shifts to the kneeling slaves.
"Get up. You are slaves no longer. From this day forward, you are citizens of the Imperium. And so long as the All-Father lives, you will never bow your knee to another master."
Now after this is complete, the Space Wolves prepare to leave the sector and venture forth to Prospero at the command of Leman Russ. But before they can do this, it is revealed that there is actually one more planet left in the sector. And they hadn't previously seen it, as the warp storms in this sector are still dissipating. The planet has no official name, and they aren't even sure if it has a population, but they can detect Vox traffic coming from it. The Space Wolves end up in conversation trying to figure out what to do. The entire Legion has been ordered to Prospero for unknown reasons. However, they still have some time before they're meant to be there. Bulveye wants to head to this recently discovered world, while his brothers want to head for Prospero. He argues that he and the other wolves had sworn oath to King Leman to bring this entire sector into compliance, and that's exactly what he intends to do. So they go to investigate. From orbit, the scars of war can be observed all over the planet's surface, and a large portion of the world is covered in abnormal levels of radiation, indicative of thermonuclear warfare. Cities can be seen, and most peculiar of all, a thin black line, visible with the naked eye. The scanners indicate it as a massive jet black spire that extends miles into the air, and judging by its bizarre architecture, the Space Wolves determined that no human hand could have constructed it. With further scans, they managed to locate about 20 of them, and weirdly, each of the spires seemed to be placed near a large human population. Bulveye and his men descend to the planet's surface in order to investigate. They touch down in one of the cities, and an enormous crowd gathers, each person eager to get a look at the barbarians from beyond the stars. The men that greet them are young, and it's noted that none of them are older than their mid-20s. A man named Andres Santano greets them and welcomes them to the planet of Antimon. The young man takes the wolves before the planet's Senate, a group of bickering old men and women dressed in exquisite fineries. The senators sneer at the wolves, and the leader, the young man's father, tells Bulveye that his son is an idiot, and that he had no right to bring them before him. They laugh and mock the wolves, and tell them to make their demands and be gone. Now, needless to say, on Fenris, such insolence would result in, at the very least, spilled wine and drawn blades. Bloody feuds had been fought for generations over far lesser insults. But Bulveye keeps a leveled head, and tells the Senate who him and his men are.
"We are not here to make demands of you or your people, nor are we the beasts you imagine us to be. We are Astartes, servants of the All-Father, Lord of Terra and Emperor of mankind. We have journeyed across the stars to bring you glad tidings. The storms that divided us have subsided at last, and Terra reaches out once more to embrace all of her lost children. That which was broken will soon be reforged, and a new civilization will arise to reclaim our rightful place as the masters of the galaxy. No doubt your oldest legends speak of the days when all people crossed the stars and found new homes upon foreign worlds. Much has changed since those days, and I am no storyteller, but let me share the news of all that has passed since Antimon was lost to us."
Now, the story of everything that transpired over the last 10,000 years is an incredibly long and compelling saga that Bulveye begs his audience forgiveness when certain events are muddled or confusing, as much knowledge and history has been lost, never to be relearned. And by his own admission, storytelling is not really his forte. It takes him hours to complete his tale, mid-afternoon fading into the night, speaking nearly continuously the entire time. No one dares interrupt him, as everything he is saying is as incredible as it is impossible. Can you imagine living your life peacefully, and suddenly an armored giant appears before you, telling you of a great galactic empire beyond the stars, and that you used to be part of it. And not to mention the 10,000 years worth of stories, wars great and terrible, and the truth of the galaxy. And needless to say, this is a lot to take in at once for any world visited by the armies of the Imperium.
That is what brings us here today, Honored Speaker. Your people's isolation is at an end.
Bulveye holds out his left hand to them, like he did with the overlords on the First World.
I greet you in the name of the Allfather. Take my hand and be at peace. The Imperium welcomes you.
The audience of senators is stunned and speechless, but the shocked silence is eventually ended by the lead senator angrily proclaiming, "Lies. All of it is lies." Now, here's the thing. Nobody calls a space wolf a liar and lives to tell about it. So that cool-headedness that Bulveye was demonstrating so masterfully up until this point immediately vanishes. But right before him and his men can make a decision that they may come to regret, the room begins to shake, and a loud noise is heard outside. And the sound that they heard was a very particular sound that the Space Wolves know all too well. It was the sound of high atmosphere ordnance being launched. The room begins to panic, the senators screaming and wailing. Bulveye and his team dash for cover, while Andras, the young man from before, follows after them. Seemingly as quickly as the battle began, it ends. Everything quiets down. Bulveye tries to contact his brothers in orbit, but can't get through to them. They have to assume that their ships have been destroyed. Bulveye turns to Andras and asks him what is going on, who is attacking them. And it's revealed to them that this planet was being preyed upon by a group of Dark Eldar raiders, known as the Harrowers. And it had been this way for generations. Andras tells the Space Wolves that the Eldar have been hunting them like animals. Men, women, the elderly, and even children. He claims that they enjoy inflicting suffering, and they seem to enjoy the agonizing screams of children more than anything else. This had gone on for so long that eventually the planet came to the hard decision to make a sacrifice to them. A lottery system was implemented. The unlucky winners of this lottery would be stripped naked and chained up in a field for the Dark Eldar to capture. Now, this system worked for a while and seemed to keep them appeased, but in recent years, the attacks had become more frequent, despite the ever-increasing number of offerings. To say this is absolutely revolting to Bulveye is a massive understatement, as it is the epitome of cowardice. Bulveye is furious at this revelation, that they would sacrifice human beings to the sick delights of depraved Xenos. He demands to know why they didn't fight back, and the young man exclaims through tear-filled eyes, "They did for a long time, but the aliens were vastly technologically superior, and eventually the Senate issued the order for no one to raise a hand against them." As the war was tearing the planet apart, Bulveye calmly tells the young man that his Senate had betrayed them, but he doesn't hold it against Andras, as he believes the young cannot be held accountable for the sins of their ancestors. He tells Andras,
"A life not worth fighting for is no life at all."
Several weeks go by as the Wolves are deciding what to do. They're taking stock of the supplies that they have here on the surface, as they still haven't been able to make contact with their ships. They decide that regardless of the limited supplies, they will do all they can to help the people of this world. First by staging an ambush for them at the offering location a few weeks later, and next by attacking one of the giant spires, where the leader of the Dark Eldar raiders resides. Now before they can make this happen, the Space Wolves receive a cryptic Vox message from somebody who wants to meet with them. And when they arrive, it turns out to be Andras, the young son of the senator, and he has an entire platoon of soldiers with him. Andras informs the Wolves that the Harrowers had attacked the Senate and killed every last member, including his father, which by the laws of their planet placed him in charge. Andras and the men that he leads want to do everything that they can to assist the Space Wolves in the assault, something that Bulveye is initially against, as this is business for the Astartes, but he's inspired by the young man's courage and the fact that him and his men want to fight for their world. So Bulveye allows this, and the human soldiers of Antimon fight side by side with the Wolves. And after a grueling battle, they are ultimately successful in killing the leader. It's at this moment that their ships are able to make contact with them once again. Disorganized and without leadership, the Eldar raiding parties descend into anarchy, each one vying for control, and this makes their ships in orbit easy prey for the Wolves. Most of them are eradicated, while a few of the Dark Eldar ships manage to escape. But with this act, Antimon has finally been freed from the vile clutches of its alien overlords. The citizens of Antimon are unbelievably overjoyed. They flood into the streets, celebrating, popping bottles of champagne, and delighting in their newfound freedom. Celebrations and joyous festivities are held across the entire planet. And while the world is celebrating, Bulveye and his men meet with Andras and his, and they're celebrating as well. Andras tells Bulveye that, "We cannot thank you enough for what you've done. I will never be able to repay you, my friend. From this day forward, we will remember this day as the day of Antimon's deliverance." Bulveye laughs and claps him on the back.
"There is no debt between us, brother. Just serve the Old Father faithfully in the years to come, and give your due diligence to the Imperium, and that will be thanks enough."
Now Andras looks incredibly confused by this. He says, I don't understand. Bulveye laughs. He smiles and waves a hand dismissively.
There is nothing to worry about in the moment. It will be months before the Imperium can send representatives to begin integrating your world with the rest of the worlds in the subsector. For now, I expect you'll want to restore the Senate, which is a good first step. The Imperial Governor, when he arrives, will need their support to ensure full certification of the planet. And then, the real work begins.
A grim look of understanding passes over Andras's face, and he takes a step back from the Wolf Lord. He says, there's been a misunderstanding. We have no desire to be part of your Imperium, especially now that we've just regained our freedom. Bulveye feels his heart turn to lead in his chest, and the Wolf Lord's brothers can sense his change in demeanor and step to his side. Andras's trio of warriors do the same for him. Bulveye pauses and desperately searches for the right words to change what he feared was about to happen.
Andras, listen to me. I came here because the Imperium needs this world. It needs every human world to come together and rebuild what was lost before. Believe me, this galaxy is a dangerous place. There are alien forces out there that would like nothing more than your extinction, or worse, and you and your people should know that better than most.
He takes a step closer, and Andras's guards lay their hands on their weapons.
We must be united in a common cause. We must. The All-Father has commanded it, and I am honor-bound to obey. Antimon is going to be part of the Imperium, brother. One way or another.
He holds out his left hand to the young man.
An age of glory awaits you. All you have to do is take my hand.
The young man looks absolutely disgusted, and a look of anguish twists across his face at what his new friend is telling him. How can you say this to me? After all we've been through, weren't you the one that said a life not worth fighting for is no life at all? His voice trembles with anger. Our world is free, and it will remain that way. Her soldiers will protect her. Bulveye shakes his head sadly.
The Imperium will not be denied. So I ask you one last time, will you join us?
The young man says no, and I will fight you if I must. With a heavy heart, Bulveye's empty hand sinks down to his side.
Very well, brother. So be it.
In less than half a second, Bulveye's axe roars to life and splits him in half. Bolter shells ring out inside the room, and the guns of the other Space Wolves cut down his men. Blood pools all around their feet, and the Space Wolf captain walks up to the Vox system and tells his brothers on the ships in orbit.
This world has refused compliance. Initiate Crusade Plan Epsilon, and prepare for combat operations.
Outside, the people of this world are still celebrating their newfound freedom as the first bombs begin to fall.